I'm here talking about spaceflight. Whenever you hear about spaceflight, you think of rockets and you think of, modern things. But rockets have been around a long time. As far as we know, the Chinese invented rockets several hundred years ago. They were used as weapons, but not quite in the way that you're thinking. They basically used rockets fired at the enemy, which scared the pants off the enemy who fled. So they didn't do much damage, but they were good on the battlefield because it scared everybody so bad. The basics of rockets follow Newton's laws. As a matter of fact, Isaac Newton was the first one to demonstrate the idea of a rocket going around Earth as a satellite. It's just a few hundred years too early for the technology. What you've got is a force pushing down. This is the exhaust gases. And Newton's third law says for every action, that's the exhaust gases, there's an equal and opposite reaction, which is the rocket going up. Problem is, once you get high enough, there's no more oxygen to burn. So that fuel tank is quite literally rocket fuel and oxygen. So because you've got that oxygen with it, it makes it really dangerous and explosive. I mentioned this in class last week. The first rocket to go up into space, what NASA defines as space, is 62 miles. That's 100 kilometers. So anybody that goes above 62 miles gets their astronaut wings. This is the rocket that the Nazis used against London during the Second World War, during the London Blitz. It was devastating, and luckily for us, it was too late in the war to actually do very much. The US Army captured some of the rockets, and the best thing was the scientists, and we brought these rockets back to United States, and we built the Redstone rocket. It was built by Chrysler, and this was completely based on a German V2. So it says US Army on it. It's built by Chrysler, but you're essentially looking at a Nazi rocket here. These pictures were taken at the US Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite called Sputnik. Satellite just means that something orbiting something else. So every moon that we talked about this semester, when we talked about the solar system, those were natural satellites. This was the first artificial satellite. This led to what we now call the Red Scare. This was in the middle of the Cold War, and this was what scared the heck out of everybody. This is where they said they're going to be putting stuff up into space and dropping nuclear bombs on us. At the time, the only way to deliver a nuclear bomb was carry it somewhere, carry it by airplane. It didn't make sense to try to sneak it in on a train or anything like that. It was to drop it out of an airplane. And the Soviet Union was so big that finding a way in and flying for many, many hours across hostile territory to get to a place like Moscow and drop a bomb was kind of ridiculous. So when they launched a rocket that could put something into orbit around space, the Americans realized eventually they were going to put bombs on those rockets, just like the Nazis did, maybe even nuclear bombs. And by putting it in orbit, they demonstrated they could reach anywhere in the world. So that was big, that was scary. And this led to the arms race. I love this title right here. Oh, what a flopnik. The first satellite was Sputnik. So they're kind of making play of words there because we were behind the Soviets. After they put their satellite into space, we tried to do the same thing, but you can see by the pictures they failed. And then they put a first living creature into space. They put a dog into space. His name was Laika. And no, they didn't have any provisions for bringing him back home. But if you're familiar with the Marvel universe, you know that he eventually made it, right? We'll just leave it there and not think about poor dying dog in space. What one difference was the Soviets did everything in secret. We didn't know about the stuff they did until after they did it. We announced we're going to launch our first rocket on live television, and they kept exploding over and over again. It was not good. We finally got our first satellite, the Explorer 1, which is this silvery object being held up by these three guys. That's the first American satellite. And we did something different than the Soviets. We put scientific equipment on board. And that equipment measured some radiation and discovered that there were bands of radiation surrounding Earth that we now call the Van Allen belts. Shortly after, NASA was formed. The logo history is actually really cool. This is the first logo, and it shows a space plane or something orbiting the Earth. For some reason, the Earth is yellow. And then it has this red, what's called a vector. A vector is a huge part of the mathematics of aeronautics. So it's like a little geek symbol thrown in there. So this was the first logo, and a few years later they changed it to this logo, which you can see is, came from that one. Now, this happens a lot, but they made the logo on a committee. And one of the guys in the committee was adamant for his logo to get approved. So one of his tactics for doing that was to start calling the other logos derogatory names. So the one you're familiar with, the blue one right here, that is called the meatball because this guy said, oh, it's just a giant meatball. And he was basically trying to get people to hate it for that reason, but they kind of liked that, and this is now called the NASA meatball. Then in the 1980s, they decided to change their logo, and this one he called the worm. Same guy, different decade. And again, he was calling it the worm to make people not like it, and that made them like it. And then in the 80s, we switched over to the the worm logo. A little bit later, I think it was in the 90s, they switched back, or the 2000s, I'm not sure. They switched back to the second original meatball logo. That's where we are today. So Project Mercury. This was our big one. We were trying to get astronauts into orbit. And if you look over here at this picture, this little black piece right up here, that's the cone. This is a control module, so this is all the electronics to control that. I said cone, capsule. This is where the astronaut sits. This red tower on top is the escape rocket. You can see nozzles right here. So if anything goes wrong, this tower blasts off, yanking the capsule with it, where hopefully it can get away before the whole thing explodes. So Project Gemini took American fighter pilots from the Korean War and said, let's get you guys into space because these guys flew experimental planes. This picture right here is famous. This is the one that they took for the cover of, I believe, Life magazine. And if you look at their boots, there's something a little odd about them. Some are white and some are silver. They had some early spacesuit ideas that they put on for the camera, but they didn't have any boots yet. So the guys put on their combat boots from the war, and some of them spray painted their boots silver. So on the cover of the magazine, they have silver boots because they were spray painted. That was that early in the program. While they were trying to get someone into space, the Soviets put Yuri Gagarin into space. And if I remember right, I think it was April, and we have Gagarin Night. It's a worldwide celebration amongst scientists and astronomers, and it's to celebrate the first human into space. Not only did he go into space, he orbited the Earth. at about 188 miles high. So this was pretty devastating. And this picture is, notice it says from Huntsville Times. Huntsville, Alabama is where they were building all the stuff. So that's where it was the most devastating news in America. A month later, we had Alan Shepard, was the first American in space. Only for 15 minutes, he went straight up and pretty much straight back down again. In 62, John Glenn was the first American in orbit. And John Glenn has got a really cool history. After this, since he was the first American in orbit, there was no way on Earth NASA was going to let him fly again because he was a national hero, and if he died, that would be a tragedy. So, as great as it was for him to fly into orbit, he didn't get to fly again yet. He actually did. And he was in a crowded, cramped capsule that barely fit him. I'll show you a picture of one of those. And he didn't get to float around like you see. So he was weightless, but he didn't really experience it. I think he was only in orbit once or maybe 3 orbits or something, fairly short. So he had ended up going off into business, I believe in Ohio, and started some successful businesses and then ran for state senator and won. So he was a United States senator for several decades. And when he retired, he was in his mid to late 70s, and he proposed something with NASA. He said, "You have all of my measurements, my biological measurements from when I was young. How about you get a bunch of measurements, send me into space on the space shuttle, and look at the aging differences of astronauts?" So they did. He got to fly up in the space shuttle and was up there for about a week. So it was really, really exciting that one of our first heroes in the space program actually got to go up and have fun. He did a lot of work in his 70s, so it's kind of interesting that we sent up a United States senator. In 62, Kennedy gave a speech where he said, "We're going to go to the moon and we're going to do it by the end of the decade." So keep in mind the history, what's going on here is we are in a Cold War with the Soviets. We think they're ahead of us. They're building all these rockets. They're going to be dropping nuclear bombs on us anytime. So this was a very, very scary part of time. The Cuban Missile Crisis was right around the corner where we were literally minutes from wiping out all of humanity. All of Kennedy's generals recommended he invade Cuba when they found the Soviet missiles. For some reason, Kennedy did not follow any of his advisors and decided not to attack. We found out much later that the Soviets had different nuclear missiles that were more powerful already ready to go in Cuba, and the Soviet general in Cuba was given orders that if the United States attacks, launch all missiles. So we were closer than we've ever been to nuclear war at this time. So this was a scary time. And Kennedy really upped it and said, "We're not just going into space, we're going to the moon." Gemini, after the Mercury missions, Gemini was designed specifically for one step in getting us to the moon. When we talked about constellations in the first week of school, I mentioned the Gemini twins. Gemini is, or as the astronauts like to pronounce it, Gemini. I don't care which way. I always say Gemini. These guys were the Gemini constellation is the twins. So that represented they were going to be sending 2 astronauts into orbit at a time. So if you look at the mission patches, this one says Grissom and Young, McDivitt and White, Cooper, Conrad, Shira, Stafford, Borman, Lovell, Armstrong, Scott. You should be recognizing some of these names. Collins, Young, Gordon. So these were the astronauts preparing to go to the moon. they did some of the first spacewalks. The first spacewalk was almost a catastrophe. They got out, and he had so much difficulty moving around that the astronaut that went up literally lost like 9 or 10 pounds of weight in the matter of a few hours. And it came out as sweat. When he got back to the deck of the aircraft carrier, he dumped his boot out on the deck and just poured water out. That was his sweat. Because it was so exhausting. His heart rate was in the upper hundreds. They were monitoring it. And that wasn't the worst part. When he got back in the capsule, he didn't fit. His head would not fit in the capsule, and when they tried to close the door, it hit his helmet. What they didn't realize is the weightlessness allows your spine to expand, where normally gravity is pulling your head down, compacting your spine. So what they did is he tried as hard as he could to squeeze and fit into the seat while the other astronaut was banging this metal door onto his head trying to get him to fit. At one point, NASA ordered the astronauts to let the one who couldn't fit back out of the capsule and let him go where he was going to die. The other astronaut obeyed a direct order and said, it's either both of us or none of us. And NASA was not happy with that. And what he eventually did is he banged that thing on his head so hard, eventually the first notch of the ratcheting mechanism caught. And then he slowly cranked it down, crushing his head down into his spine, and put so much strain on him he actually pulled a hamstring in his leg. But he made it back to Earth and lived. So, interesting story. Crazy. During that spacewalk, the fact that they struggled so much, they figured they could never ever do a spacewalk until one of the other astronauts, Buzz Aldrin, came up with a method, realized it was just Newton's third law. When he grabbed a handle and twisted it clockwise, it spun his whole body counterclockwise. So Buzz Aldrin said, let's just cover the outside of the capsule with handholds and footholds so you can hold on to it while you do stuff with your tools. And that's what we do today. They also put 2 capsules into orbit and rendezvoused for the first time. They actually connected because that was something they would have to do in the Apollo missions. So I told you that I would show you a picture of the Gemini capsule. That is an actual Gemini capsule, and that's me trying to fit in it. I did not fit. I believe the height was 5'9" or 5'10" was the limit. So any astronaut bigger than me or bigger than that would not fit. So at the time, I wouldn't have even been considered to be an astronaut. I actually have an astronaut rejection letter. It's I think I put it up in Instagram, which is Science Class 411 if you wanted to look it up. But one thing I remember from that picture is the seat, the headrest, if you will, was actually like formed for your head and shoulders. And me trying to squeeze in there and then get back out, my shoulders hurt real bad from just trying to squeeze in there. The picture on the right is actually super cool to me because this was over at the United States Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And this is when I went to space camp. And we were walking around a museum and they were showing us all this really cool stuff. And the curator brought out some stuff from the back. She gave us this glove and it has metal bands right here at the opening to attach to the spacesuit. And she said, thank you. And she said, if it doesn't fit, don't try to force it because it will hurt. And we really don't want to have an actual glove from the Apollo missions get stuck on somebody here and have to cut it off. So when we looked in, the label said size N Armstrong. So naturally I had to try it on. Now, if you look back over to the left, I was I am bigger than the astronauts of the time. So um, nothing happened, so I'll tell you what did, but I put on the glove, and yes, it hurt and might have taken a little skin off. I mean, this metal ring, and I got the picture, and then we kind of people gathered around trying to get it off my hand. That's where the skin part happened. But um, I actually tried on Neil Armstrong's glove. Whether or not this is a glove that he used or if it was part of the batch made for him, I don't know, but it was pretty cool. Then we had the Apollo mission. The Apollo program was designed for 3 astronauts, and this was going to the moon. So we have is the Saturn V rocket developed by none other than Wernher von Braun, the head of the Nazi rocket program of the V2. He was one of the ones that surrendered to the Americans and came and built rockets for us. This rocket is the height, look at it on the left there, is a 36-story building. If you put it in downtown Atlanta, it would be one of the smaller buildings, but you would definitely see it. If you go out to Huntsville, Alabama, the Space and Rocket Center has a reproduction of one of these that you can see sticking up from a distance. It's really neat. The folks at the Space and Rocket Center hate it. Originally, a millionaire came along and said, I want to build a hotel for people to stay here and make this a better attraction. If you build the rocket, I will build a launch pad with hotel rooms in it and a restaurant on top. So they said, great. And they raised several $1,000,000, built the rocket, and the millionaire backed out and said he wasn't going to do it. So the rocket is there, but it costs so much money, and they were hoping that it would generate more money that they ended up losing a ton of money and having to lay off a lot of people that worked at the Space and Rocket Center. So it's super cool. Everybody likes getting pictures of it, but it is hated by that complex for a reason. We have this method right here. This in the middle, the CM stands for Command Module. This is where the 3 astronauts go. You can see that there's a little triangle. That's the capsule. We have the Service Module here, which has all of the electronics and everything in it, and the fuel, I mean, everything you need. This is actually the part that got damaged during Apollo 13. The LEM, the Lunar Module or Landing Module, this is what actually landed on the surface of the moon. During Apollo 13, this service module got damaged and they lost power and they moved over to the landing module, closed the door and fired up the batteries, fired up the computer in there to see if they could do stuff. One of the things they did is they shut down the computer to the service module to basically reboot it. You know how you're having trouble with your computer or your phone and everybody says turn it off and on again? Well, that's exactly what they did, but they had never ever tested it to where they could boot it up from the batteries on board. So if it didn't boot up, those astronauts were dead, and it did boot up. So very, very crazy. So what the design was for this, along with one of these engines, and by the way, there's an engine right there compared to the size of people. I think they were called the F1 engines. A diver found one off the coast of Florida about 10, 20 years ago, and they pulled it up and found the serial number, which was like 003 or something. They just had a number on it and identified it as one of the engines from Apollo 11. So it's kind of cool that they recovered a piece of it. This whole section fits right up here on top of the rocket. So if you look close, you can see a little circular thing. You can't even see the capsule. It's like my mouse is covering it. That is this section right here. So all of this is rocket fuel just to get us to the moon. And then we had all of this go to the moon. Then the lunar module, the lander, the LEM, detached with 2 astronauts on board, landed on the moon while 1 astronaut stayed in the command module. Afterwards, the bottom half of the LEM would stay behind while the top half launched back up into orbit, reconnected with the command module. They went back to Earth, and then everything but the capsule right here disconnected and burned up in the atmosphere, and the three astronauts came down in this capsule. That rocket to fire from the lunar surface back up into orbit had never been tested in a total vacuum of space. So the astronauts basically said a prayer and pushed a button hoping that rocket would go back up into orbit, and every single one of them did. The official last words on the moon from Apollo 17 was this scripted thing that the astronauts said. And then he said, let's get this MF out of here. He didn't abbreviate, hit the button and launched. So the official last words of the moon were the speech, but what was really said is, let's get this MF out of here. And it worked. Okay, unfortunately, Apollo 1 had the first catastrophe of the United States. They were on a training schedule. They were sitting in the capsule with everything as if they were there. They had pressurized the capsule, they were communicating with the radios back to base. And they were having a lot of trouble. The radios weren't working properly and they were really struggling. And then all of a sudden, a fire broke out. What they determined is there was a wire under the cushion of the seat that shorted out, caught fire, and they had been using a 100% oxygen environment, which meant it completely burned up and killed them almost instantly. So that set us back quite a while. And notice this is 1967, so we are nearing the end of the decade when Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon. And that everybody, the 100,000 people that worked on this program, were really trying to get us to the moon at the end of the decade to honor Kennedy, who had previously been assassinated. Pause this and read it. This is actual transcript from Apollo 10, and it's about the funniest thing there is. And then, of course, July 20th, 1969, we finally landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong was the first one to step out, followed by Buzz Aldrin. And yes, Buzz Lightyear is named after Buzz Aldrin. Pixar came out and said that later. And Michael Collins stayed up in orbit. So for every Apollo mission that went to the moon, 2 people went to the surface and 1 stayed in orbit. We had Apollo 11, 12, 13 went around the moon and came back. So they didn't set foot, but they went to the moon. Oh, and Apollo 8 was the first one to go to the moon, but they didn't land. It was just the first, going around the moon. And then Apollo 15, 16, and 17. So I think there was like 21 people or so or 24 people that went to the moon, and about 12 that actually set foot. And the Soviets didn't do any of that. They were the first ones to land an object on the moon. They basically just shot a rocket at it and crashed into it. And then they had a lander that broadcast some pictures back. But no, we were the first ones there. So this is the service module of Apollo 13. You can see this thing is blown out. So when they used the lander as a lifeboat to go around the moon, coming back to Earth, just before they got back, they ejected the service module so they could come back down. And that's when they first got a look at just how bad it was. Our first space station was Skylab. And it was a Saturn V rocket that was modified to become a space station. The problem was the shielding broke. Something broke. So the first people that went up there had to go in the capsule with their spacesuits. And the temperature was hundreds of degrees because the insulation was gone. And this little square gold foil thing is essentially an umbrella. They pushed it up through an opening, opened it up, and then sealed everything off so it would reflect sunlight away. So, it Didn't stay up as long as they expected, and some of the parts landed in Australia. One of the parts went through the roof of a mobile home out in the desert. And there is one county or region, I don't know what Australia calls them, or city in the outback that sent a fine of $25 to NASA for littering. And it was more, you know, in fun, tongue in cheek. And they like to claim today that NASA's never paid them. So it's pretty funny. This picture on, oops, this picture on the bottom right is the fuel tank. And it made it, this is actually as they got it off the desert floor in Australia. And I don't remember if it had fuel in it or not, but they actually have one of the pieces that landed in Australia. Then we had the space shuttle program. It didn't first launch in 72, but that's when they started doing it. I'm going to tell you roughly how old I am. I was in elementary school, and a bunch of us went to the library where they set up a TV, which was the first time we'd ever done anything like that. I know you guys are used to us having projectors and remember the TVs on the cart rolling them in. Yeah, we kind of have that going. And we watched the first space shuttle launch. And what I remember is the main fuel tank, the MFT right here, was white at the time. After a few launches, one of the engineers said, "Why are we painting this thing anyways?" It was like $20 million of paint and added several tons to the weight of the vehicle. And the other engineers went, "Yeah, we don't really need the paint." So ever since then, they stopped painting it. So everything, this was the cool thing, everything was reusable except that MFT. They had what they called one of the engineers described it to me. He said it was like a bullet and a butterfly. It was the same stability as strapping a butterfly and a bullet and having the butterfly survive. You've got this very fragile aircraft, the orbiter, which is technically the orbiter is just this. The whole thing is called the space shuttle. And the orbiter is sitting on the side of a rocket being blasted into space. So, not the most stable configuration. It was very dangerous. In fact, this was simply a prototype of a reusable spacecraft. You know that prototypes are only meant to be used, maybe a few times so they can build the final project. Well, to save money, they never did the final project. This was it. So this flew for like 30 years. I saw the Atlantis on the launch pad during a tour once, and I saw Challenger do a launch. And when I look back and try to guess the date, I might have actually seen the maiden voyage of Challenger. And we were at Disney, and my grandmother heard about it, and nobody else wanted to go, but she and I jumped in the old station wagon and started driving east. And on the radio, they announced that they were going to be launching soon, and everybody on the highway pulled over and got out of their cars, and we saw what looked like an airplane, flying overhead, but off in the distance, and except you could see a bright light at the head of the smoke trail. So wasn't close, but I did get to see a space shuttle launch. That was mine. I did see one up close in person, and that was the Endeavour, which was built to replace the Challenger. I also was homesick that day, January something 1986, I believe, when I was watching TV and I was saw the news break in that the Challenger had exploded. And this was the first time that I knew of where they interrupted and broadcast the same news pretty much all day long about the shuttle being destroyed. So I remember that one. The STS, Space Shuttle Transport System, involves a payload bay. So this was like a NASA's pickup where they would send satellites up into orbit. The Hubble Space Telescope was not launched on a rocket. It was launched in the bay. In fact, that silver cylinder there is a satellite. It was launched in the bay of one of the space shuttles and placed into orbit. And with this, they were able to do something that they'd never done before, where they flew along next to the Hubble Space Telescope later, grabbed a hold of it with a robotic arm. You can see it in this picture right here. It was built by Canada, so it's called the Canadarm. There are two of them, and they put both of them up on the International Space Station, and it's basically a robotic arm, and they use it they can move it around on the outside like an inchworm. It'll move its way across the surface. It's kind of cool. This was my job at Space Camp. I was in charge of the payload bay. So during our simulated launch and everything, I was the one that opened the doors and went through stuff. And this little window here is actually a TV screen, and that is a TV screen, but it would simulate what we were seeing so we could watch the bay doors open and everything. Now, I'm one of those people that has a really hard time listening and talking while there's a lot of other noise going on. There were five of us on the shuttle, and there were about five or six or seven of them in mission control. And we could all hear each other talking, or I could hear everybody on the shuttle talk, and the commander back at the mission control. So we were reading checklists off to each other, and you had to find the voice that you were listening to, and make sure you listened when somebody was talking to you. So it was really, really hard to do it over the headset. The commander at Mission Control was listening to us and everybody in the room. So they had like 12 or 14 people in their ear talking to each other. And then every single one of us would relay back to command, I just did this. And somebody on the ground would send an instruction for me to do something. So the person there literally had all these people in their ear talking to each other and them, and they said it was the most stressful thing. Okay, so there's Challenger from 86, and Columbia, I remember that one. This was when text messaging was actually fairly new, and I got a text message from CNN that they just lost that space shuttle, Columbia. Make sure you cut that. The Columbia, the space shuttles overall would start reentry around Texas and land in Florida about 15 minutes later. They left a trail of sonic booms from Texas to Florida that the residents were familiar with. When this exploded, it left debris across several states, I think from Texas to Mississippi or Alabama. Most of it, I believe, was in Louisiana and Arkansas. And a lot of it was toxic fuel or materials, things that when they break open and you get exposed to them in the environment could cause cancer or things. So everybody in those states was told, report what you see, but do not approach it. So there was debris everywhere in people's yards. So they would call their local police, who would call NASA and say, okay, we have what looks like this in their yard. And imagine a chunk of something from space sitting in your yard, and you're told to stay away from it because it could be dangerous. So yeah, it was a crazy time. The Soviets put up a Space Station Mir, which means peace in Russian. And one of the cool things is they invited the Americans up. So Americans did get to stay on the space station toward the end of the Cold War. There was a Soviet cosmonaut on board when the Soviet Union fell. And think about that. You are a Soviet citizen. You're up in space hearing about how your country has fallen apart, and you're wondering if they can get a rocket to come get you and bring you back home. So he stayed up there extra long, and when he came back to Earth, He was no longer a Soviet. He was Russian. His passport was invalid, stuff like that. It was kind of nuts. We built the International Space Station in 98. We say international because different segments of it were built. You will hear things like last year they found a leak in the Russian module and they had to close it. So the Japanese, Russians, Americans have all built different sections of it. So it's like 20 something countries have contributed to it. And I mentioned the Canada arm. There's one right there, and the other one is right here. So those two Canada arms are on the International Space Station now. They were originally on the Space Shuttle. This right here, docked on this end, that capsule, this is a Soyuz capsule, a Russian capsule. When we stopped flying the Space Shuttle, we had to pay about $80 million a seat to get Americans back up into space, and we went on the Soyuz. The American astronauts would go to Russia, and they actually had to speak Russian and stuff as part of their requirements for going into space. Okay, this is where you want to pause it and just take a breath, because this is just one of the best pictures. They put a cupola with all these windows around it, and this is where astronauts can go make measurements and observations, but it's their favorite place to hang out, like she is. Can you imagine? Okay, 2004 was cool. It was the first time that a private company put somebody into space. And they did it through a method that was used with Chuck Yeager to get this to break the sound barrier. They had what they called the mothership, which is this airplane here, and underneath it was the space plane. And they went really high up and they dropped the space plane, which fired its rocket engine and went up into space. They had a live color video from the cockpit, and to demonstrate and celebrate that they were in space, he opened a bag of M&Ms, and the M&Ms floated all over the capsule. That was super, super cool. So there is a Spaceship Two. I believe this is the one by Virgin Airlines with Bronson, I believe, is the CEO. And he's constantly saying, okay, we're going to be able to get people into space. They've already sold the seats. You can't buy them anymore, but the tickets are $200,000 a seat. And you get something like 15 minutes of space time. And you get to float around and everything. But he is going to be bringing his family up on the first flight to demonstrate that it's safe. It's now 2020. We're about 5 years or more beyond when he said they were going to do it, but it sounds like they're actually going to do that. You've heard of SpaceX because of all the success, but when I first made these slides for my astronomy class, I was excited about it, and everyone really hadn't heard much about it. The Dragon capsule right here was the first one to deliver materials up to the space station, the first commercial spacecraft. And yes, there's the Canada arm right there holding on to the capsule. So this was from Elon Musk, who invented PayPal, and then somebody bought it from him while he was in college for something like $1 billion. So he's a college kid that wrote some software, started this website company, and became a billionaire overnight. So he started SpaceX and Tesla Motors. His goal is that we are killing our planet quickly, and we need to fix it, and we also need a second home because there is no planet B right now. So he's the one that wants us to get us to Mars. So that is the goal of SpaceX, is to get humans to Mars. And one of the first big steps was getting this Dragon capsule to space. And then the Dragon Crew capsule, I did not change the slide from last time, got up there this year. So it was about a year late and delivered the first astronaut to the space station. These pictures are their spacesuit. Now think of the Apollo spacesuits. They're still used today. this looks like a sci-fi movie sort of thing. But they put one of their spacesuits in the capsule along with this toy, I don't remember, and they launched it up to the space station. And I think that one was November 19th. And it got there and it worked, and they brought it back and it landed autonomously back on Earth, and everything worked. And then they got the first astronaut up to the space station this year, and I believe it was last month they sent four astronauts up there. So America is sending astronauts into space again this year, and they're going to be able to do seven at a time. So seven astronauts. So super exciting. They have like touch screens and everything. It really looks like what you think of as a spaceship compared to the Apollo ones.